Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Geopolitical Futures podcast. I am Cole Alton, joined by Jacob Shapiro, Director of Analysis. Jacob, hello.
Hello. You've been doing so well that we thought that you should introduce me, then me introduce you.
Well, we're doing it a little different this time because we're experimenting with a new format, and we're really excited about it. Very soon, our very own Xander Snyder is going to be joining us by way of internet. It's really cool. But before we actually get there, once again, I want you to do like a preview of the week. What's sticking in your craw today?
Well, here are the things that we're going to be looking at for sure in the week ahead. Number one, China just got rid of term limits.
Yeah.
So for the president, it has been basically since Deng Xiaoping took over for Mao, there have been term limits, and Deng sort of created this political system where something like Mao was never supposed to happen again. And Xi Jinping just said,
Mao's happening again.
Mao's happening again.
It's here.
China is reverting back to an old pattern. So
they still have, I would say, informal age limits. I don't suppose that they're going to recognize those anytime soon either, right?
You know, this is the question, though, and this is the thing to watch going forward. Like, what other conventions is she going to break? Yeah. Is there going to be any backlash to this type of stuff? You know, the actual, I didn't think that she was going to step down in the first place, but she is now coming out and saying, I'm here, I'm not stepping down, nobody's taking over for me. So the question then is there going to be any resistance? Is anybody going to speak up and say no, or has she already cleared the deck? So that's some of what will be driving our attention there. Second, just going into the weekend, Mexican President Peña Nieto canceled an upcoming meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. And the reason was that Trump wouldn't agree to say that Mexico was not going to fund the border wall. And the thing that's interesting to me in this is that it was Peña Nieto who brought it up, not Trump. So Peña Nieto, maybe it's part of Mexican elections coming up and he wants to score a shot for his party, but I remember Peña Nieto a couple of years ago when Trump was the candidate, and he spoke with Trump when a lot of people were telling him not to because he thought that was what was in Mexico's best interest. So I have a hard time thinking that he's just doing this as an election ploy. It says to me that he thought that there weren't going to be any serious consequences. Anyway, that's my own conspiracy theory generating stuff there, but one of the things we will be looking at is the state of U.S.-Mexico relations, because with violence increasing in Mexico, with Mexico going into elections, with NAFTA negotiations, and now with some pretty open, at least verbal disagreements and maybe verbal hostilities, is that a thing? Between
yes, it's a thing.
It's a thing.
I think if you and I both know that is a thing. There had several verbal hostilities launched in our direction.
So that's also on my mind. We'll have to see what direction U.S.-Mexico relations are going. And then last but not least, the Middle East is still on fire. It is the most active region in the world. We are following it every day. It's actually almost hard for me to write about anything else but the Middle East every day right now. But the thing in particular that's happening this week is that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is going to get a little interview with the police. They want to talk to him about some corruption stuff.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming is probably not the right way to put that, but the investigation has been going on for a long time, and it's kind of made its way to the foreground yet again. We didn't write a whole lot about it. We wrote a little bit about it, and there was a Syrian middleman in Turkey, and it was like very, very kind of like Dashiell Hammett, like it was very interesting. But he's getting interviewed by the police.
He's getting interviewed by the police, and honestly, none of this is that important. If you're like me, you sort of enjoy these internal political kerfuffles. I sort of missed the days when Israeli press was going crazy about the amount of ice cream that the Netanyahus were buying each year with state budget.
Which turns out was a lot.
Pistachio ice cream, apparently good. Like, get yourself some mint chip is my advice. But anyway, it doesn't actually matter, this political corruption case. What matters is Israel about to go through a bout of internal political instability, just as Iran is emerging, as Turkey and the U.S. are trying to bury the hatchet, as Syria and Lebanon and Gaza are all simmering. I don't think so, but we have to double check ourselves.
And it's never too early to think about some of these like key countries, and when they do have leadership transitions for any reason, natural causes or corruption or term expiration, whatever. It's important for us to think about like who might eventually replace them and what they're about and how, if at all, they're going to change things. Okay, so it's been a pretty busy week in Syria, you could say. There's been a lot going on, and specifically, yeah, I don't. There were some U.S. airstrikes over in the east, and we can get back to that here in a little bit if we want to. But in particular, I want to focus on a little place I call Afrin. It's been super busy there. There are alliances that pop up and die seemingly like every 30 minutes or so, and it's hard to make a whole lot of sense of it. Luckily, we've got Jacob Shapiro here to make sense of it, and joining us from California is Xander Snyder. Xander, how's it going?
It's going great, Cole. How are you?
I'm doing great. So I really want to turn this over to you guys who know much more about it than I do. Give us kind of a rundown of what's happened in the past week, but I think it might be helpful for more casual readers and listeners, and for people like me, I'll come out and say it, to sort of give a broader view of what some of the allegiances and alliances were in this part of Syria initially, and talk about how they've changed. And I think after that we can kind of go into what some of these new developments kind of portend. Does that kind of make some sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I guess if you're just thinking about, sort of from the 20,000, foot altitude of what's going on here, you sort of have to start with the United States, when all this stuff broke out in Syria originally, tried to partner with Turkey because it wanted to defeat the Islamic State, and it thought Turkey was going to be a natural partner to do that. Turkey didn't want to commit its troops to do that, and also had its own concerns about the Kurds, who we will get back to here in a minute. They play a prominent role in this story. Then the U.S. tried to find some moderate Syrian rebels, and they found that it's easier to find unicorns in Syria than it is moderate Syrian rebels. So then the U.S. turned to the Syrian Kurds. When that die was cast, what you had basically two separate coalitions developed, both of which were directed against ISIS, but which weren't necessarily allied with each other. You had the United States, which was backing the Syrian Kurds and whatever other small, moderate groups who could get on the ground, the occasional airstrike from Syria, and then you had this sort of a troika or tripartite, triumvirate, whatever pretentious word you want to use. Trilogy, three-headed monster of Turkey, Iran, and Russia. And the three of them were meeting in Astana, and they were meeting in Sochi, and they were going to try and design some kind of future for Syria while the battle for the Islamic State was going on. So up until about December, what we had Turkey, Iran, and Russia basically coordinating and setting up these different de-escalation or no violence zones within Syria. You had the United States supporting smaller proxies on the ground. You had both of these groups pushing back against ISIS and having the bulk of their forces pushing back against ISIS. Once ISIS gets defeated around November, December of last year, suddenly things begin to change. And maybe Xander, how would you say that things changed once in December, once that started?
Well, several things changed then and have changed since then. But I think a distinction that's worth making that can help place all of these events in slightly better context is this troika that you mentioned, for example, Russia, Turkey, Iran. Just because these states are working together and they have interests that seem to align for the time being, or at least they have tactical considerations that make sense for them to cooperate, does not mean that they're actually attempting to achieve the same thing long term. So a lot of the times the coverage of these events will be, oh, well, Turkey and Russia were allies and now they're not anymore. And that's a huge development. But if you step back and realize that they're actually trying to achieve very different things, and that by them cooperating in the short term is really only a means to an end, some of these developments make a little bit more sense. Well,
exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that maybe right now isn't the time and place. I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but at the same time, it might be worth kind of mentioning real briefly, if we can, what are some of the long-term goals for some of these people involved?
Yeah, well, Turkey is. We've written about this at length, an expansionist power, and essentially what they want to do is create a certain degree of buffer space on either side of them. And this basically their core is the Bosporus, and a lot of their power stems from control of the Bosporus. And if you look at the history of the rise of the Ottoman Empire, it's basically a story of them building out strategic depth on both sides of the Bosporus, and then finally in the Eastern Mediterranean as well, to basically prevent all of the powers that border them from threatening their core. So that is, on a deep level, what Turkey is looking to achieve in the Middle East, is building their borders out, or if not borders, then at least areas of influence where they can generally control the events on the ground.
All right, fair enough. What about their quote unquote allies? I'm being a little facetious. Russia and Iran.
Sure. Well, Iran is hoping to, well, not really hoping to. They've already begun to establish this land bridge that everyone is talking about. And all that means is a contiguous territory on land from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon, through which they can supply their proxy Hezbollah, and developing a Shia corridor along that land bridge as well, which essentially lets them secure their supply line, because Iran is worried about if there's a lot of Sunnis living along that line, then that might threaten their supply. It also lets them reach the Mediterranean. So looking at it strictly from a territorial perspective, that's what Iran's hoping to do. They're hoping to achieve that through supporting different entities like Assad in Syria, like Hezbollah, like some of the popular mobilization forces in Iraq.
Gotcha. So this is actually probably a really good example of what we mean by the temporary alignments. Interest coming briefly into alignment, but long-term goals not really working out. I mean, so you nicely laid out what Iran wants to achieve. Those goals are not the exact same as Russia's, and yet both have at different times supported Assad in different capacities, right? So what is Russia trying to do? Because it's not the same thing as Iran, correct?
That's right. Russia has been a historical adversary of Turkey, and at different times Iran, but to a lesser degree. And ultimately, Russia is concerned with keeping whatever chaos is going on in the Middle East south of the Greater Caucasus, which acts as sort of a barrier between the Middle East and the Russian heartland. And in a related way, Russia's also concerned about keeping out jihadists from Russia, because there's a large Muslim population in Russia that could potentially create some instability in different areas. So because Russia's main concern is keeping it away from home, they're actually okay if Turkey and Iran slug it out with one another, so long as it keeps both of them weak enough to not secure a strong enough position in the Middle East to come back and challenge Russia.
Well, actually, I think that's true now, but I think Russia, as Xander sort of alluded to, it's a perfect example of the phenomenon of mission creep. Because when Russia went into Syria in the first place, some people will say it was because of pipelines and this, that, or the other thing, or because they were friends with Bashar al-Assad's dad. None of that's really true. What was happening when Russia decided to go into Syria was two things. Number one, Putin had just gotten embarrassed in Ukraine. He had not been able to stop a pro-Western government from coming in, taking out and taking over basically in Kiev, and all he had to show for it was Crimea and some areas in the Donbass. The second thing that was happening was that oil prices were collapsing, and you saw a lot of problems in the Russian economy as a result. And the analog that we've talked about many times was that in the early 90s, Yeltsin watched the United States get involved in the Balkans and could do nothing about it, and this was a traditional Russian sphere of influence, and the Russian economy tanked. So you had Putin, who was supposed to return Russia to glory, and instead of returning Russia to glory, Russia wasn't able to do anything in an area that it thought of as integral to its national security, and its economy was tanking. So the reason that Russia went into the Middle East in the first place was a little bit to distract from that. It wanted to show that it was a great power. It wanted to show some of the military improvements it had made since the 2008 Georgian War, because especially the Air Force had not availed itself particularly well in that conflict. And once Russia got there, as the United States experienced in Iraq, it was very difficult to get out, because it's nice to go in and blow some things up and declare victory, as Putin has declared at least a couple times now, as far as I can count.
Congratulations, Putin.
Congratulations. Like, you have Syria, but what does he have in his hands? He's trying to get Iran and Turkey to agree to this diplomatic solution. And as as Xander alluded to and as you alluded to, Cole, it's all falling apart because there are different interests between all those sides. And this troika of interests, now that ISIS is gone and is not there to unite them, you basically have them all working at cross purposes. And a lot of the stuff that is going on here is that Iran is pushing forward aggressively, and all of the different powers, Russia, Turkey, the United States, Israel, the Syrian Kurds, they are all responding to that push. So if you just, in one sentence want to understand what's going on in Syria, Iran is trying to push in. And then all of those other, rearrangements that are happening around it are reactions to that. And different countries are at different levels of preparedness for combating that, or in Russia's case, trying to hold Iran back. That's sort of how I would think about it.
What about you, Xander? You agree with that for the most part?
Yeah, I think the way Jacob outlined mission creep makes sense.
And you've alluded to it a little bit, and I want to allude to it a little bit more, just because they're some of my favorite people in the world to talk about. Kurds. Like, where are the Kurds in all of this? I think it's a horrible thing to say, but I don't think it's an unfair thing to say that while everybody in the Middle East kind of disagrees about everything all the time, they kind of all coalesce around this notion of not liking the Kurds, or at least wanting more than anything to deprive them of statehood.
Well, Xander, I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to thank Cole for just teeing up a big fat grapefruit for me, because every time an editor comes back to me and says that we have to talk about the Kurds, I get to do my little diatribe about how there is no such thing as the Kurds. The Kurds are not a monolithic group.
No.
They speak different languages. They have different languages. I just said that. I meant they have different religions, although most of them are Muslim now after some of the things that have taken place.
Sure, but like...
Well, they weren't always. If you go to Jerusalem, actually, they're the remnants of the Jewish Kurdish
All
community.
right, we can talk about like different success stories they've had, like Rojava, and I forget the place in Iran, but there are pockets of them in Iran and pockets of them in Syria, and Syrian Kurds behave differently from Turkish Kurds and from Iraqi Kurds. Like we all know this, but they are important to note nonetheless, different though they may be, because they are used and exploited by these powers a little bit differently, and fight amongst themselves, right?
Yes,
So,
and historically have been used
Sure.
by powers against each other. Before the Western powers went into the Middle East, it was really, you had the Ottoman Empire and various forms of Persian empires, and they used Arab groups and Kurdish groups to fight each other. But so if we're just talking about Syria, the two groups of Kurds that we really have to talk about are, number one, these Syrian Kurds, who in the fight against ISIS and in the Syrian civil war were able to carve out sort of an autonomous zone for themselves.
and their acronym, Kurds love their acronyms. There's a lot of acronyms in Syria. Generally, the YPG, those are the Syrian Kurds. Just and I want to be clear on that, because we've kind of identified most of the cast of characters. I mean, Saudi Arabia's been a little involved over the years. I don't know if we need to go over that right now, and Lebanon's been kind of like tangentially involved. But these are the major players along with the United States. So now that we've kind of identified who these people are and generally what their objectives are, we can kind of talk about why they use each other temporarily and why they don't, and maybe the better way to do that is talk about what's happened this week.
Yeah, I just to finish the thought, that we have to finish the thought. Unfortunately, I have to come back and finish the thought.
Fine.
I know it's terrible,
Fine.
but there are also Kurds in Turkey.
Yeah.
And the Turkish Kurds and the Syrian Kurds, of all the different Kurdish groups that are there, are probably the most closely related, just in terms of language, background, all that other stuff. So when we're talking specifically about Turkey, Turkey looks at the YPG and sees their own Turkish militant group, which is the PKK. Those are inseparable from Turkey's point of view. And that has always been the major break between the United States and between Turkey. Because the United States saw that this YPG group, these Syrian Kurds, were willing to fight ISIS on the ground with U.S. support, and Turkey was like, well, you can't support one terrorist group to fight another terrorist group, especially one that counts some 15 or 20 million people as part of our population that has been waging an active insurgency in our country for however long. So you sort of talking about what happened in the last week. I think, and maybe Xander you'll disagree, I think the most important thing that is happening right now is what's happening between the United States and Turkey. Because for so long, what was consistent in the last couple of years in both the Trump administration and the Obama administration was that ties between the U.S. and Turkey were fraying. And it got really, really serious to the point where you had Turkey's foreign minister about a week and a half ago saying that relations might be broken off completely. And then you had Tillerson go there, you had both Mattis and McMaster sort of reach out to their Turkish counterparts, and then suddenly there's not an agreement, but there is a lot more dialogue and a lot friendlier tone coming out of both Istanbul and Washington right now. And notably, Turkey is distancing itself, if not in rhetoric, then at least from the interests on the ground of both Iran and Russia.
What do you think, Xander? Is Jacob full of it or what?
Yes, always.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I mean, the answer is almost always yes, but give us some particulars of why this time he is more so than other times, or not.
No, I think this is actually a good segue to what happened this week, which, Cole, you wanted to get into. One of the two major developments was coming out of a meeting between Tillerson and Erdogan, and I think also the Cavusoglu was there as well. And while they were meeting in Istanbul, James Mattis and his equivalent on the Turkish side were meeting, I think, in Brussels. And on Friday of last week, so I guess 2 Fridays ago now, basically there was an announcement that some sort of deal, while perhaps had not been reached, had at least been discussed and presented. So the Turkish side said, okay, well, how's this? We'll work together with you, the U.S., to basically secure Afrin, which is this area that we're concerned about the Kurdish presence in, as well as Manbij, which is an area just a little further east of Afrin. And we'll do that with U.S. cooperation, and in exchange, the U.S. agrees to relocate the YPG, this Kurdish presence, so that we don't feel threatened on our borders. And this was actually in response to a proposal that the U.S. had first presented to Turkey saying, okay, well, how about we help you fight the PKK, which is the Kurdish terrorist organization within Turkey, and we'll do that with the YPG. And Turkey was like, no, that's stupid because we think they're the same thing. So you can't do that. Here's our deal. And it seems like it's been fairly well received. There hasn't been a firm agreement yet, but there were some reports earlier in the week that Tillerson was going to come back and talk to some U.S. generals about it, try to get them behind it, because it really seemed to align everyone's interests back to where Turkey and the U.S. could actually be collaborating as allies, which presumably they would both prefer. They would prefer their interests to not diverge over the Kurdish issue. So that's kind of where we were in the beginning of the week.
Okay, well, so you said a lot of people's interests align, so fair enough. But what about where's Syria in all of this, right? This is all technically happening in Syria. Are they just sitting there twiddling their thumbs? What are they up to?
There's a lot going on in Syria. I think what's mainly occupying the Assad regime's attention right now are two major fronts, one of which is this Idlib offensive, and the other is Afrin, although it also looks like they're about to open up, I don't know if you can call it another front, but at least launch another offensive.
Hey, Xander,
yes.
Xander, let me cut you off. We'll mark this. This is totally my fault. I meant to lay that up for you for Assad kind of partnering with YPG. I apologize. That was super vague.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, totally my fault. But that's kind of what I meant by that.
Got it. Do you want to lead?
Yeah,
the second
just
development?
just as a way to seg into the other aspect of
Got it.
that you brought up in the piece the other day. My fault.
So that segues pretty nicely into the second development that we saw this week, which is Assad. It appears as if Assad is now working with the YPG in Afrin to repel the Turkish invasion. And while there's a lot of detail, essentially what happened is the Assad regime sent pro-regime forces, and that's an important distinction from Syrian army forces, to Afrin to supposedly support the YPG. It still seems like we're not entirely sure technically if they're going to engage the Turkish military directly, but it definitely does not seem that Assad has positioned forces there to fight the YPG. It definitely seems like they have a tactical alignment of interest to repel the Turkish invasion of Syria in the northwest.
Well, okay, you brought up Assad, and we haven't really talked too much about him. He's obviously going to be busy up north in Afrin, because that's where a lot of the action is. But that's not where all the action is. I mean, we're geopolitically, we're not all over this right now. But there's a whole lot of like horrible things going on in Ghouta province. Am I getting that correct?
Yes.
I apologize for any of my horrible pronunciations. My Arabic tutor in college would be devastated right now. But I forget things very easily.
Yeah, so I think there's basically 2.5 fronts, if you want to call it that, main fronts in Syria. And I'm oversimplifying this, but one is Afrin with the Turkish invasion. The other is Idlib, where Assad is attempting to capture a large region in the northwest of Syria held by pro-Turkish proxies. And the other is trying to just stamp out whatever pockets of resistance exist in other parts of the country. And this includes the province of Eastern Ghouta, which is just to the east of Damascus, further south in Syria.
So what about what's going on over in the east? We haven't really talked about Eastern Syria in a while. There was some news not that long ago about some more developments in and around Deir ez-Zor, right, Jacob?
There was. So just to piggyback on some of the stuff that Xander just said, the Assad regime is really the most aggressive of all the players involved here because the Assad regime is fighting for its survival. If it stops fighting, that means it's probably going to collapse. Iran is egging it on because Iran wants Assad to be very strong, but also wants it to be dependent on them. So I say all that to say that there's this. It's sort of a mystery of what happened in eastern Syria, but about a week and a half ago, there are these reports that the YPG, which are supported by the U.S. in this part of Syria, were taking fire from some pro-Syrian militia forces that apparently had some Russian mercenaries too. The YPG called the United States for help, and an incredibly impressive barrage of B-52s and F-15s and Apache helicopters and drones came in and wiped out, or depending on what reports you're reading, inflicted significant damage.
Yeah,
on
it
this
didn't
force.
seem like what you might call a casual airstrike or a showy airstrike. It was a heavy hit.
It was a heavy hit, and we should note that one of the reasons this is a mystery is because and there are a lot of different retellings of this, and it's difference on casualties and difference on who started, and was it about an oil field or was it about this? One of the things that seems to be routinely said, though, in all the stories is that it took about 3 to 5 hours for the U.S. to respond via airstrikes. I think the United States would have had to have been a little bit better prepared to marshal the amount of air power it did to knock this thing out. So
it took us almost 3 to 5 hours to schedule this podcast.
I think that's generous.
Yeah, exactly.
But when it first happened, there was actually a lot of stuff I found out about it on social media, because there were sort of Facebook posts from this military contractor group or people related to it saying, well, a lot of Russians just died in a U.S. airstrike in Syria. And at first the Russian Foreign Ministry was denying it, and then the Russian Foreign Ministry said, well, no, this happened, but it's not our place to comment on what Russians are doing in Syria if they're not connected to the armed forces, and these weren't connected to the armed forces. But what you have here is sort of the sort of gray line between both the United States and Russia in Syria. So Russia has its interests, the United States has its interests, and for the most part, Russia and the United States have not run afoul of each other in Syria, in large part because in the long term, they actually have fairly similar interests. Neither one of them wants to be stuck there, and neither one of them wants a power to emerge, and neither one of them is interested in sort of Sunni jihadism coming there. But this is where, when these relationships start churning, and when you start getting actors like Assad, for whom there is no other option besides all-out war, that's when war starts to get unpredictable. That's when tactical things on the ground can actually move political things. Now, it's looking like this is not going to be that, because Russia has downplayed it, the United States has downplayed it. Nobody is trying to make this a bigger deal than what it is right now. But if you just look at the number of things that have happened in Syria in the last week, I mean, the United States has bombed forces that support Assad that have Russian mercenaries as part of them. Israel has bombed both Assad targets and Iran targets inside of Syria. Turkey is setting up military outposts within reach of Aleppo and is getting attacked by Shiite militias that are sponsored by Iran. So when you're looking at all of these things moving together, and I didn't even mention the Syrian Kurds, who in one part of Syria are trying to partner with the Assad regime because they want to defend Afrin, and then in this other part of Syria that I just talked about are taking fire from Assad forces and calling in U.S. B-52s for help. So that's like sort of the broad lay of the land. And
It's just that simple, right?
it's just that simple. But the concern has to be going forward, like, is something going to happen that is going to create a political reality? Because if those weren't Russian mercenaries, for example, if that were regular Russian soldiers, which I am not saying it is, repeat, not saying that's what it was. This is a
Do it
hypothetical.
one more time, just in case.
If that's the word.
Okay.
If that were regular Russian soldiers and the United States had blown up, let's say, a regiment or something, or even just a company of Russian soldiers, you can bet that Russia and the U.S. would not just be like yelling at each other and stealing flags from their embassies. You can bet that that would probably escalate in a big way and that Putin would have to do something about it. So all of these different forces are moving in such close quarters right now, and everybody is trying to move forward to establish their interests, that the situation is getting, ironically, much more complicated than the simple days when all that had to be done in Syria was defeating ISIS.
Those were the days, weren't they?
Those halcyon days of yore.
Yeah, all right.
I will say though that the thing in all of this is that it's really, the Assad regime is out of options. They have to continue fighting, and Iran, really, this is their big chance. If they don't jump on the opportunity right now, they're going to lose their chance, especially because they depend on Assad.
Well, especially because, and I don't know if this is because of, or, like, despite, but, like, we haven't heard much of the Saudi Arabia lately, which is pretty interesting. Like, they've been pretty quiet lately, no?
No, well, Saudi Arabia has a lot of troubles at home, and they are pledging to, build $64 billion worth of, like, movie theaters or something like that in the next couple of years, because...
Pretty important.
If you can watch Black Panther, apparently you're not going to revolt against the Saudi monarchy. I don't know how the law.
Did you know, this was true about a year, I haven't looked at it in a while, but about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, China, through its holdings, owns more movie theater screens than any other country, and it's not even really close.
I didn't know that, but I knew that, like, a lot of, well, we're getting way off track now, although I guess the geopolitics of cinema, like, if you
Yeah,
can't...
you brought up Black Panther. This is like...
I did.
Like an intermission, because we could talk about this for a long time, about, like, isolationism versus, like, globalism and, like, Black liberation theology. We can go down many rabbit holes. We won't, but I just want you to know we could.
We could, but the interesting thing there is that, like, if Chinese people decide they don't like a movie and it doesn't have an opportunity for resale in the Chinese market, that actually now affects, like, Hollywood's bottom line, because they depend on those resales in the Chinese market.
Yeah, I think it was, I want to say it was Star Wars The Last Jedi. It killed in the United States, and, well, in, like, Western markets more, but fared very poorly internationally. I think, but don't quote me on that. It was a big blockbuster recently. I think it was that one, but I'm not sure.
All right, well, I'm going to take us off of this, because otherwise it'll be Geopolitical Futures, the last podcast. Good jest there.
That's funnier than it deserves to be.
But just to bring it all back home, and I'm not trying to add a silver lining here. I would just say that the point at which this is going to get really hard is if all of these different actors run out of options.
For more geopolitical insights from the team at Geopolitical Futures, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter using the link in the description.
It gets bad if the countries involved don't have options, and if everything becomes a zero-sum game. So the fact that you have this horse trading back and forth between Turkey, Russia, the United States, even Iran, although Iran to a lesser extent, different proxy groups on the ground from Hezbollah to the YPG, that all tells you that none of this is set in stone, and that everybody has options and is trying to figure out what's going on. This could become a much bigger war if everybody starts thinking like the Assad regime, if everybody starts thinking like they have to intervene. Like, Turkey right now is really just providing some support to some Syrian rebels that it has trained up. It's really just dipping its toe in Afrin. If Turkey decided that it really needed to go at it against the Assad regime and had to prepare for a battle with Russia, that would be disturbing. And that's why when you see the U.S. and Turkey burying the hatchet, you start to go, okay, well, these sides are now preparing for something a little bit more serious here. And you start wondering, where is Israel? Where is Saudi Arabia? Where is the Arab world? What are Iran and Assad and Russia all discussing when they're in these things? So the moment at which those relationships actually start to harden is the moment that I would start to worry that this is going to go from, and I know it's tragic, but the casualty numbers in Syria right now are relatively small. This is not yet a major war. If you get multiple countries locked against each other and their interests can only be met by defeating the other, that's when this conflict starts to look really serious.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jake. Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask you. He's told us what worries him. What worries you, Xander?
Well, I was just going to expand on that point a bit. If you look at the cumulative casualty count in the Syrian civil war since 2011, it's heartbreaking. It's large. It's something like 500,000 people have been killed. At the same time, if you look at just like the Turkish invasion, for example, it's only been going on for a little over a month. The estimates that Turkey is releasing is something like 30 Turkish soldiers have been killed. It's probably larger than that because, of course, the Turkish government is going to undercount that. But we have varying reports of something between 6,500 and maybe 15 or 20,000 Turkish soldiers either in Afrin or at the border. Now, the Turkish military has something like 300,000 soldiers in it. And while they have to worry about their western border as well as their eastern border, that just gives you a sense of how much this could potentially escalate. And if you look at some of the major wars between Turkey and Russia in the past, I mean, you're talking about circumstances sometimes where 50, 60, 70,000 soldiers would be killed in a single battle. I'm not saying it's going to get there, but I'm just adding to Jacob's point that it is in part the flexibility that has kept this from escalating from a really tragic, bloody civil war into a general international war between nation states, which tend to be far worse.
Yeah, amen. I think we're all glad it's not really there yet, and they certainly are too. That's probably all the time we have for today. This is as good a place as any to stop. But I want to say, Xander, thanks for taking the time. Even though we can't see you out there, I'm sure you're smiling and happy, and it's sunny and beautiful out in California. It's damp and dreary and awful here in Austin, Texas. So we're a little jealous.
Good.
And obviously Syria is like incredibly complicated. Hopefully this sort of clarified rather than obscured the understanding of the situation. But if nothing else, you get to come away with the fact, knowing that we know less about international cinema, and I don't really know how to pronounce Afrin. Did I say that right this time?
I thought you did say that right. You didn't say it right?
No, that was Xander was the one saying it correctly. I was saying it very poorly.
I missed that.
All right, well, Xander, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
You have yourself a nice weekend. Jacob, thanks.
See you out there.
Bye.